Slow Burn Media and Bill Huffman present this week's episode of My Passion Case with special guest Nick from the True Crime Garage podcast. Hello and welcome to this week's episode of My Passion Case. I am your host Bill Huffman, and again, this is a Slow Burn Media production. On this week's show, I am featuring Nick, the host and co-host of the True Crime Garage podcast, and it is probably one of the top 50 podcasts in the world, and I am very lucky to have had him as what I would consider a mentor in this industry, and he is very, very informative on all things true crime, and this week's case is no different, and we are discussing Amy Hooper and the unsolved murder of 1992. So let's just jump right into my conversation with Nick and discussing the case of Amy Hooper. Thank you so much to Nick from the True Crime Garage podcast, one of the best podcasts in the true crime genre available on any podcast platform. And this week, I am very lucky to be once again joined by Nick from True Crime Garage. So thanks a lot for joining me, Nick.
Thank you so much, Bill, for having me on once again. I am Nick from True Crime Garage. It is a good podcast. I don't know if it's the best one out there, but thank you for saying so. And you can find True Crime Garage on any platform out there. I appreciate being asked to do this passion case, and I've seen the list of guests that you're having on, and I've seen the list of cases that they are talking about. One, it's an impressive list of guests, so you should pat yourself on the back for that. If I were in Northeast Ohio, I would pat you on the back right now, but we are doing this. I'm calling in from Columbus, and you are at your Slow Burn studio. So the cases that were selected by your other guests, all fascinating cases as well. Now, the case that I'm going to discuss today is a lesser known case. This is a case from one of my old haunts, one of my old neighborhoods. And that's part of the reason why this became a passion case for me.
I apologize to interrupt, but you did mention something about the neighborhood.
So when asked to do this, there were several cases that came to mind, but this is certainly one that I've been focusing on of recent. This was a case that caught my eye many years ago, and partly because the murder itself took place in a neighborhood that I once lived in. Now, we're going to be talking about a young woman. Her name is Amy Hooper. She was only 20 years old when some savage took her life. She was killed in her apartment. Her apartment was in the Lincoln Village neighborhood. So if we were to take a look at Columbus, at the greater Central Ohio area on a map, basically what you would see is 270 is the outer belt. So roughly a circle formed around the city of Columbus. We have suburbs that are all on the outside of that outer belt. On the west side, we have Lincoln Village. And Lincoln Village is rather big, but it's divided by Broad Street. Broad Street runs from east to west, and it runs directly through the center of Columbus. Now, that road is Route 40, so it continues going on and on quite far west. Lincoln Village is divided into Lincoln Village North and Lincoln Village South, and it's divided by that Broad Street. This young woman lived in an apartment in Lincoln Village. This case is one from the early 90s, and where it ties in is at one time in my life, not at the time of the murder, she was a little older than me, but I did live in Lincoln Village for about a year and a half. That is primarily the reason why this case caught my attention. Anyway, I looked into this case, did a little research on it, and this was years ago, and I just kind of put it away in a file folder, and it got lumped together with a bunch of other cases. Well, about a year and a half ago, I was cleaning out my desk, my office, going through all my old materials, looking, to downsize. What do we throw away? What do we keep? And I come across her file folder, which I'd pretty much forgotten about. Now, I picked it up, I read it, reviewed everything that I had on the case. And then I mentioned it because it was from an area where I was from. I happened to mention the case to my mother and to my father. Now, my parents are divorced and have been for many years, so these were separate conversations. The weird thing about this was not only had I once lived in the neighborhood where Amy was killed, but my mother worked with her mother. They taught together at a school here in the greater Columbus area. When I mentioned that to my mother, she told me how upset she was, obviously, at the time. She knew her mother well. And then on top of that, how upset my father was at the time. And this was a case that he continued to follow from afar in the papers and on the news. But he had a general knowledge of the case when I brought it up to him as well. So it was interesting to learn that the roots for this being a passion case were planted many, many years ago.
Mm-hmm.
So let's get into her case, because her case is one that bothers me terribly. I think that it should have been solved. It was a very violent murder, and there are several suspects, or at least suspects that have been discussed throughout the years regarding this case. It's one of those ones where you feel like there's just something. There's one tiny little puzzle piece missing to solving this thing. Now, her family is still alive. She had older sisters, and her mother, unfortunately, is pretty old at this time. She's elderly. They live, I believe, out in Colorado. When I found this file folder and reviewed the information, I reached out to her family to see where they were, if they're still around, if they would talk about the case. And her sisters were willing to talk about the case. And the first thing that I learned is her mother was still around. And I thought, damn it, let's talk about this case one more time. Let's bring it up. Let's bring it to the spotlight, throw it out there to all of the garage army, see what they think. At least we can put some ears and eyes on this case. Maybe something comes forward and we can solve this thing while her parents are still around. So let's dive into some of the details of this case.
Let's do it.
Amy was 20 years old at the time of her murder, and she was living at an apartment that she was renting. This apartment was located at 4942 Medfield Way in Lincoln Village. This is in Columbus. Now, this apartment is not like a big high-rise type building. Amy's apartment was on the ground floor, so the door opened into a grassy open area outside. There was a parking lot nearby as well. She was killed March 9th of 1992. She moved into that apartment in February, on February 17th of 1992. So she lived there for like 3 weeks before this murder took place. She was found by her family. And the way that this story goes down is there was a lot of movement going on of her leading up to the murder. And we'll kind of sidestep some of that because it's not so important. But the key factors of this case leading up to it is Amy did not own a vehicle. Okay. She worked at a leather shop that was at the Westland Mall, which was not terribly far from her home. She would often take the bike. She would often take the bus or get a ride from a friend or coworker to and from work. She had no problem getting to and from work from her apartment. Now, keep in mind, she had only lived there for 3 weeks. She didn't own a car, so she was borrowing at times her sister's car or her mother's car. She's killed on a Monday. Now, on that Monday, she is returning her mother's car. She had been out of town for the weekend visiting a friend that's a boy. I don't know that I would go as far to say her boyfriend, but a friend that was a boy that lived and attended Bowling Green University, which is north of Columbus. She was returning her mother's car from that visit. And when she returned her mother's car, she picked up her sister's car and drove back to her apartment complex. She parked at the apartment complex, went into her apartment, and then after that, everything kind of goes dark. We don't hear from Amy. Now, Amy was supposed to attend a meeting at work that day. She not only worked at this leather shop, she was one of the managers there. The things that I've heard from her family, and I have spoke to her sisters, what I was told by her family was it was their belief that she was supposed to lead this meeting. And that will become important in a minute, and you'll see why. Eventually, her work starts calling her mother. Now, everybody's probably going, well, she's an adult. Why would her work call her mother? She never showed up for work that day. She had worked there for about 7 months by this time. She had never been late, never missed a day. This was very out of the ordinary. She was an incredibly responsible young woman. Her mother was listed as her emergency contact. So when they got scared, they called her mother. The issue being here is her mother, just like mine, was a teacher. And this is 1992. So her mother is teaching class. She's in school teaching children. And I believe it was a middle school. She is being told that there's phone calls coming in for her, but she cannot tend to these phone calls until later in the day. Eventually, she makes the phone call, finds out Amy never showed up for work. We hear this, Bill, you've reviewed so many cases, and it's strange, but a lot of these cases you hear and see some of the same things. And one thing that we always hear is a mother's intuition. Immediately, her mother's like, she got a very bad feeling and wanted to investigate this situation immediately. She gets on the phone with her ex-husband, which is Amy's biological father. She gets on the phone and contacts Amy's sister as well, the sister with whom she borrowed the vehicle from. And she's saying, look, I can't leave until the end of the day. Can you go over and at least check out the situation, go to her apartment, call her, nobody can get a hold of her, so on and so forth. What this leads to, obviously, is a lot of moving around. Now, we have her father arrives at the apartment complex with the sister. They find the sister's vehicle parked outside of Amy's apartment. They knock on the door. The door is found locked to the apartment. That's a key in this case, too, and you'll see why in a bit. But eventually, her sister, she brought her own key to the vehicle and decides, I'm going to take this vehicle. I have to go about my business. She had to go to work that day. So she picked up the vehicle, went to work. Father can't get a hold of Amy. He eventually leaves. Now, once the mother gets off of work, and this is just a short time later, they return. They return to the apartment complex. They want to know what's going on. Again, just attempting to knock on the door, try to get a hold of their daughter. Again, no answer. Door is locked. They approach the super of the apartment complex, asking if they could gain entry into the apartment. Again, Amy's mother is listed as a contact. She has this, she's able to grant permission for entry into this apartment. The super opens up the door. The father goes in and he finds Amy, who's been brutally killed. And thankfully, the other family members did not go into the apartment, did not have to see what he had to see. I'm not going to go through everything in the best of detail because I have been privy to some information in this case that I don't want to throw out there because it is important to the investigation. But basically, Amy is found upstairs on the floor of a bedroom. She's bound. She's naked. She's been hit in the head. It was a very violent strike to the head. One of the newspapers actually described it as her head was split open. She had been stabbed. There was a decent amount of blood in this room. And she had been left there for dead. Now, the way that this plays out, the science of it is it's believed that the strike to the head, the blow to the head, occurred before the stab wounds. And oddly enough, you and I have discussed Amy Mihaljevich's case so many times. She was hit on the head. She was stabbed in the neck, and she was stabbed in the chest. Amy Hooper was hit on the head, stabbed in the neck, and stabbed in the chest. It is believed that she was struck on the head first, and that strike was actually violent enough that it was, in fact, fatal, and the stab wounds occurred after she passed or as she was passing. Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, those post-mortem wounds that you mentioned, now, what are your feelings on those actual wounds?
Well, it could signify overkill. It also could signify a very inexperienced killer, or maybe somebody that showed up and did not intend to kill. We hear so many times in these cases that when there's overkill, it has to be a very personal attack. It was somebody with a lot of aggression towards a loved one or to somebody that they were very close to. Look, I've reviewed enough cases where a complete stranger went total overkill on another complete stranger. So I don't put a ton of weight into that. I try to just listen to what law enforcement, what they are telling us, what they're willing to release. And that's where things get weird in this case, because they've never claimed to have a clear motive as to why this young woman would have been attacked inside of her apartment, brutally killed and murdered. And I think what is missing here is an understanding of what the motive was. This is one of those cases where I believe that if you were able to hone in and pinpoint the exact motive for murder here, that might give you a big red arrow pointing directly to who should be your prime suspect. So one of the things that was reported in this case very early on, now, mind you, I followed this case from time to time when I was younger. I didn't know some of the details that we will get into until within the last year and a half. I know some of these details because of information that I've received from law enforcement and information that I've received from her family. And I'll get into some of that in a bit. But at the time, and one thing that continued in the public's eye for years about this case was, remember we said that she was found bound, okay? Now, we can't say for certain if she was tied up before or after she was struck in the head. That detail is a little tricky to figure out. But the item that she was tied up with, this was not a rope. She was tied up with basically a necklace. This was like a medallion that hung off of one of those leather straps that you might see, that something that would be purchased at like a festival or something of that nature. The newspapers really circled around that detail to put out a good story for many, many years, stating that this could be something that the killer brought to the scene with them and something that they left at the scene. And it could have some significance to the case, meaning some significance to the victim or the perpetrator himself. Now, I will state this. There was evidence at the scene. We know this was a male offender. Now, regarding that medallion, one thing that I was able to very quickly, let's say, clean up, and I think that's one of the things in the cases that kind of upsets me the most with this case anyway, is the way that the public was kind of led down this path of this medallion, this necklace is so very important to this case. It's the key to the case. When what we end up finding out is her sister confirmed that she was with Amy when Amy purchased that necklace, when she purchased that medallion. They bought it at I can't remember if she said it was a concert or some kind of festival, but she was able to confirm very quickly that not only did Amy own this item, so we can believe the killer didn't bring it with them, she also owned many other necklaces like this one that she said she hung them off of a lamp and off of some other item in her bedroom. So anybody that went into that bedroom could just grab one of these things. You didn't have to get into a drawer to find it or anything like that. Now, police believe that she was either getting ready to take a shower or had just got out of the shower. That was what they released to the public. I've reviewed some information that suggests she was getting out of the shower when she was attacked. And so she wasn't necessarily stripped. She was already in a state of undress when the attack went down. Now, here's some tricky things about this case. Remember, we stated that the family, when they went looking for Amy, they arrived in the apartment is locked. Police found no signs of forced entry in this case. So that could mean several different things, right? Everybody's always said, well, that means that she let the killer in. So it has to be somebody that she knew or felt comfortable enough at least opening up the door. Again, I've reviewed enough of these cases where some people open up a door and then the perpetrator forces their way inside. Okay, you can get people to open up a door under a ruse. We saw BTK do it, pretending to be a guy from the phone company. We talked about on True Crime Garage recently about the Amy Mahalovic case where there was a suspect, Kenneth Stanton, who was pretending to be a police officer or somebody from the Food and Drug Administration knocking on doors of young kids. There are ways to get people to open up the door if they don't know you. Okay, so it doesn't have to be somebody that she knew, first of all. And we recently covered a case where the perpetrator figured out how to get into the home without breaking in. He managed to obtain a key to the victim's apartment. There are any number of ways that this killer could have got into her apartment on that day.
There are just so many different ways that people can be confused, as well as being caught off guard if somebody just shows up at the door. I mean, I hate to bring up the old skit from Saturday Night Live, but, knock on the door and, who is it? Land shark. Are you sure you're not that shark that's been going around attacking people? Oh, no, mailman. And, they open the door. So, I mean, it's possible for sure. And unfortunately, people make those decisions.
Let's talk about a couple of other things real quick before we move on, because there are some suspects that we should get into. We said that she was hit in the head. She was killed with what has been described by the medical examiner as a sharp, blunt object. Now, it's described as that because that weapon was not found at the scene. This was something that police searched high and low for. They're out checking alleyways. They're opening up trash cans. They're going all over looking for whatever this item could be. It could have been a hatchet, a hammer, anything like that. A sharp, blunt object is the best description we have. Now, what we do know is the knife that was used in the stab wounds was left at the scene. It's never been stated publicly if this knife was one that was already at the scene when the killer arrived, meaning if Amy owned it herself. We know she owned the medallion. We've never been able to confirm that the knife was already in the apartment. It could have been brought to the apartment by the killer. So we have a few things going on here. No sign of forced entry. We have one of the weapons left at the scene, one taken with them, and we have this weird medallion that we've already kind of brushed aside. The suspects in this case, it's a bit weird because some of these have been discussed publicly and some of them have been brought to my attention by the family and some of them have been brought to my attention through local rumor. There is some thought going on here regarding the friend that she went to meet at Bowling Green. And there was some thought at the time that maybe one of her family members was responsible for this. We should also mention that at the time of the murder, or leading up to the time of the murder, Amy had a roommate. Now, this roommate was a single mother, a young woman who had a small child. Amy's family is not certain, nor is law enforcement certain on how this relationship came about, how this single mother and her small child became a roommate of Amy's, other than it was a charitable act, that Amy was trying to do something nice for this young person, help this young single mother get on her feet before she goes off on her own. That's everyone's general thought on what was going on. The tricky thing with the roommate is, and you can look at this two ways, either she's telling the truth or she's conveniently out of town the day of the murder. She was down in Florida. In fact, it took a few days for law enforcement to be able to locate her. Now, this was not because she was hiding from law enforcement. This was just, given the time, 1992, she's down there on a vacation or visiting someone. There was plenty of physical evidence at this crime scene. And I cannot say for 100% certainty how some of these early suspects were eliminated, but I can say that they were, in fact, eliminated. So this boy, this young man, 19, 20 years old, attending Bowling Green, he was vetted, he was looked into, he was interviewed. He has an alibi. He was nowhere in the area. And some of the people close to him were looked into as well. Those were early on suspects that didn't go anywhere. They didn't have anything to do with this murder. Some of the family of Amy's that was looked into have been cleared publicly as well. This brings us to what else could it be? So it doesn't appear that it's somebody on her immediate inner circle. So we got to go one step beyond that. Well, what do we have beyond that? Well, we have prior relationships. We also have coworkers. We would have extended friends to look into. And that's where this suspect pool gets a little larger. She was known to have dated a couple guys in high school that was a very rough situation. And one in particular, these are all accusations made by the family, so I don't want to go through them in too much description here. But whatever was going on between this boy in high school and Amy was severe enough that the family took her out of that school, and she attended another school for some period of time. This boy was rumored to have been violent towards her. I don't know on how many occasions or the details as such, but that's the general idea of this. This guy was considered a suspect because this is going to be somebody, when the police get into this stuff and they start clearing people and they need more people to look at, they're asking the family, they're asking that inner circle that they've already cleared. Okay, who outside of this circle should we be looking at? Of course, this guy's name's going to come up. They once had a romantic relationship together, even be it that they were young people and children. But this relationship did occur, and it did have some hostility towards it. And so his name was brought up. I cannot say that that individual was ever 100% cleared. What I will say is we need to keep in mind a few things. This relationship was years before the murder. A couple of years, 2-3 years before the murder. Could he be a suspect? Could he be a good suspect? Yes, maybe. But most people move on. And it's very likely that they had little to no connection with each other at the time of Amy's murder. Now, where we go to from here is there was rumor at the time that Amy was aware of some individuals that were working for her that were stealing from the store. Doesn't sound like a big deal, but a leather store is going to have some things of significance, some things that can be expensive, things that would be easy to steal from the store that are probably valued at several $100s that you could sell later on the streets and make a little bit of cash, right? The rumor was that 2 individuals were stealing from the store. Amy was aware of this, and at that meeting that day, she was going to bring this up at the meeting. She was going to bring this to whomever's attention, to the proper authority, I guess, at the store, proper chain of command. So the rumor was that one or both of these individuals may have known this and went to her apartment that day to confront her and get her, maybe to talk her into not revealing that they're stealing from the store. And when she disagreed with them, when the conversation didn't go the way they wanted, and they couldn't get Amy Hooper to agree to what they wanted, a fight broke out and then the attack occurred. That's a possibility. It's certainly a possibility. One thing that really makes that suspicion even a little more interesting is one of the individuals that was rumored to have been involved in those thefts, or at least worked at the store at the time, was a man that grew up to be a police officer. Now, keep in mind, these are mostly adults working at these stores. They're young adults, 18, 19, 20-year-olds. So he would have become a police officer not too long after Amy's death. His father was the chief of police. Now, of course, everybody listening, there's all kinds of red flags going up, alarm bells going off. Anytime you say that one of the suspects or a person considered to be a possible suspect was in law enforcement, everybody goes, well, it was a cover-up and he knew how to do it and all that jazz, right? We should be very clear here of 2 things. First of all, he was not an officer at the time. I don't believe his father was the chief of police at the time as well. So keep that in mind. And then on top of that, the murder was investigated. It fell under the jurisdiction of Franklin County Sheriff's Department. This man who grew up to be a police officer worked for the Columbus Police Department. So completely different. agencies, a different investigating agency here. The Franklin County Sheriff's Department has no reason to cover something up for somebody in Columbus PD. They just don't. Now, I'm not saying that eliminates him as a suspect, because he's never been eliminated.
Mm-hmm.
But he's also a guy that we're talking since 1992 has had a spotless record. He's not been involved in anything nefarious since. Well, I shouldn't say since. We don't even know that he was involved in anything nefarious at all. He's an interesting suspect, but I want to take this a step further to what I think actually is more likely in this situation, okay?
Okay.
I think that first of all, I'm so very proud and so very happy that True Crime Garage was able to clear up, through the help of Amy's family, that medallion has nothing to do with her murder, other than it happened to be something quick for the killer to grab at the moment. It was not brought to the scene. This was not something that has anything to do with the killer at all. It has everything to do with the victim. It has everything to do with the crime scene. But in relation to the crime scene, let's keep this in mind. Is it, as much as a coincidence it might be, that there was a rumor that Amy knew of some kind of theft going on at the store and that she was going to bring it up to the chain of command during that meeting, the thing that we know to be fact is she had just recently moved into that apartment complex. Personally, I feel that if there is no connection to the store, to any of her coworkers for this murder, and there are things that I cannot discuss regarding the crime scene and regarding details of the homicide that will suggest that there was a different motive for murder than to cover something up, to cover up a little theft. And that would point me in the direction of the key to this case might be the apartment complex itself. Could the killer have a tie to the apartment complex? Was this somebody that lived in the apartment complex? Was it somebody that worked there? Or was it somebody that was a regular visitor to another tenant of this apartment complex? We're talking about a lot of apartments, talking about a lot of people living alone or with just one roommate. It would not have been terribly difficult for an individual to see a young woman, 20 years old, 5'3". I've been told by her family she was about 90 pounds soaking wet with 2 rolls of quarters in her pockets. To see a young, attractive, petite woman going in and out of this apartment by herself and start to formulate some kind of plan. Now, the tricky thing is the door was locked, right? The door was locked to her apartment. So that means either the killer gained entry or was allowed entry by Amy, the occupant. Came in, for whatever reason this attack occurred, she's murdered, and then the killer fled. So everybody points out, well, wouldn't the killer have to have had a key or some way of locking that door? They don't have to have a key. They may have. But I spoke to her family, did not know this or couldn't recall this. Mind you, I'm talking to them 26 years after this terrible event.
Well, you did go to school for computer, so I can understand where they are coming from.
Yeah. And I was in school for computer for at least 12 years. So anyway, I spoke to some of the people that lived in the apartment complex at the time, back in 1992. And one thing that I was told by some of these people that lived in the apartment complex is that, remember those, Bill, you're my age, so you're old enough to remember this. Remember for a while, I don't know about new builds now, but remember for a while the popular thing was to put the old push button lock on a door handle. If I'm leaving my apartment, I could push this little button on the inside of the door and close the door behind me, and then the door would be locked. The door handle would be locked, but not the deadbolt above it, because the deadbolt, you need the key.
Are we talking about like bedroom doors and bathroom doors? You know, the ones where you could just like stick a bobby pin in and kind of unlock it with one little switch of the hand? The
persons that I spoke to that lived at the apartment complex in 1992 told me that they recall in their apartment that they had the push button lock to their front door.
Oh.
Okay, so one of
Safe.
the individuals told me that this was a lady. She said that I distinctly remember it being a push button lock on the front door because I was always yelling at my boyfriend, who would just push the button, lock the door, and close it behind him, and wouldn't turn around and lock the deadbolt with the key as well. So she just very distinctly remembers that this push button lock was at her apartment. Now, I want to throw one caveat in there, is that there in this apartment complex, there were two different styles of apartments. You know, you typically have like a garden apartment and you have a townhome style apartment.
Mm-hmm.
The individuals I spoke to lived in a different style than Amy's style. So they couldn't confirm 100% that she had a push button lock on her front door, but all of them did. So what I'm getting at here, Bill, is that it wouldn't have been terribly difficult, and nobody has to have any keys or to be a super or to be a maintenance man working there to go into this home. There's a chance she could have left the door unlocked behind her in some kind of hurry, and the killer made his way in on his own, or she opened up the door. The killer very easily could have attacked her, killed her, left, and chose to buy some time by pushing that button on the door and closing the door behind him. And we do know that it did, in fact, buy some time, because Amy's sister and father had showed up prior to when she was later found. And they checked the door and said it was locked and went about their way. So to me, I think that there are several interesting suspects in this case, but I just got this gut feeling that the apartment complex is, in fact, the key to this case. I think that somebody that frequented there, worked there, or lived there saw this young woman going in and out of her place alone, and this deviant decided to attack her one day. Now, I don't know if his intentions were murder, but that was the result, and that's the charge that he will get when we find him. The other thing about this case, and I want to address this very quickly, but I've been fortunate enough to be in a position where I'm able to try to not just work on covering some of these cases and putting them back in the spotlight, but to actually do some real, true boots on the ground work on some of these cases. And I've been involved with an organization called the Porchlight Project. And if anybody wants to find out more about that, they can check out porchlightonline.org. We also accept donations. Now, those donations do not go to my pocket or contribute to my pizza and beer habits.
Mm-hmm.
These donations go straight towards trying to help with cold cases in the state of Ohio. Now, one case that we are currently working on is the Barbara Blatnick case. This is a young woman who was murdered and found near Blossom Music Center. We have been working with investigators, with the local police there, as well as private investigators, and we've been making some movement on that case. Now, regarding Amy Hooper's case, I presented that idea to the Franklin County Sheriff's Department. I will say this. The Franklin County Sheriff's Department has been very open in their communication with me, and I am forever grateful for that. They've been very hands-on with the family as well, keeping them updated on the state of the case and asking them questions and reaching out to them when needed to do so. I say all that praise, yet it's been over 20 years, and everybody wants this to get solved. Everybody needs this to get solved, especially while Amy's mother is still with us. She deserves to know what happened that day and who is responsible.
Yeah, we know with another case with the name Amy where you don't always get the results that you're looking for.
So with Amy Hooper's case, I've been very fortunate and thankful to Franklin County Sheriff's Department. They've been great. I've offered up the services of the Porchlight Project to help with Amy's case. That might be something, a route that we go eventually. But the hopeful thing here is I've been told by investigators Amy Hooper's case is not, in fact, a cold case. that it is an active case. And believe it or not, they still receive some leads and some tips and some things to look into from time to time. They're not willing to call this one a cold case just yet. The investigators that have worked on this case are very passionate about it. And I know of one in particular that has told Amy's family that before he retires, before he hangs up the badge and gun, he will solve Amy Hooper's case. So one of those cases, Bill, where there is a lot of hope, and I'm hoping that by putting this case on your show for all your wonderful listeners, many of them who are familiar with Ohio and Columbus, that this case could ring some bells. Talk to somebody that was around back in 1992 on the west side of Columbus. Somebody could have solved something. The other thing that solves a lot of these old cases is somebody tells somebody something eventually. You know that thing you saw on the news? Oh, I know who did that. I heard from my drinking buddy, or this creep was always hanging around this apartment complex. Any of those things could help. And as said, the investigators are very passionate about this case, as passionate as I am. And
is there a number down there for anybody who has any information to contact if they do have tips in regards to the Amy Hooper case?
If anybody does have any information, the number that they can call to get in touch with the Franklin County Sheriff's Office is area code 614-525-3333.
All right, great. And for anybody out there, you can always be anonymous. And you know, it's like these cases, if they don't have resolution, they loom over a city. You can look at the Mihalovic case. You can look at pretty much you name the case in your town, and I'm sure it hangs over the city. And if you do have any tips, we always suggest, 1, submitting the tip, and 2, you can remain anonymous. This isn't something like you have to put yourself out there and testify. This is just, hey, I think this might be something I saw, and it may not be consequential, but it's better to get it off your chest than to let it go, and it may help. So remember that you are a contributing part of society, and you can remain anonymous by submitting a tip via Crime Stoppers or whichever, authority you go to. So just keep that in mind, and do remember that your information does actually help solve these cases and help cities move on, because it really does hurt a town when they have a murder basically looming over the city.
The investigators, Franklin County Sheriff's Department, has told me this is very much an active case, and they've shared that with me as well as Amy's family. Also, if you feel more comfortable submitting a tip via email, you can find you can click on the submit a tip button on their website. Just go to sheriff.franklincountyohio.gov, and it's very easy to find from there.
Okay, I'll throw that in the show notes as well. So if anybody does have information, they will have easy access to the key players in the Amy Hooper case. So do you have any final thoughts on your passion case? I know that this is obviously a case that is close to you, and I'm assuming you would like to see resolved ASAP.
Well, it's just so sad that we see a young woman. She's only 20 years old, her whole life ahead of her, and she was really getting her foothold on her life at this time. She had just moved out of her parents' home, been out on her own for 3 weeks. She was charitable. She was helping out somebody else. She was a hard worker, never missed a day at her job, and her job was at this leather shop, which doesn't sound like that big of a deal, but she's 20 and she's already a manager, and her personal goal was to save up some cash, to mature a little bit, and then go to school and pursue her hopes and dreams. We can't say what the motive here was for this murder, but what we can say is none of that shit was ever as important as what Amy was going to go on to do. So again, it's just another sad, tragic scene where somebody, out of their own selfishness, just really really a few moments of no thought other than pure anger and pure destruction takes away somebody's whole entire life and has scarred and hurt Amy's family. You know, I spoke to her sister, and they are still very much in search of answers. It has been a long time, so thankfully there has been some healing that has occurred throughout the years, but they still would like to know what happened to their sister. So I'm truly hoping that it is, in fact, an active case. I believe the investigators, and I believe that they are following up on whatever information that they currently have. I just hope that if it ever becomes inactive, that maybe Porchlight Project or some other organization can step in and lend a helping hand.
You know, I do think it is important to keep cases like Amy's in the spotlight, you know, by doing shows and podcasts and, you know, your Porchlight Project and, you know, reaching out to the Franklin County Police. I think it definitely helps in the end. And I think with all cases where there's no resolution, I think any bit of extra help is, well, helpful. So I think that if anybody does have information, they can be a part of helping solve an unsolved case and bringing resolution to a town and a city that needs it. So I definitely support all of what you're saying, and I hope that Amy's case is resolved sooner rather than later, but it has been a long time, especially since this case was in 1992. But we've seen it happen, and it happens weekly now with genealogy websites and genealogical forensics. So fingers crossed.
Personally, to everyone out there listening, if they want my advice on submitting a tip, I would go the route of submitting one via email.
Okay.
And as said, you can find that at their website, at the Franklin County Sheriff's Office website, which is a simple Google search of that will bring up their website. Submit it via email for several reasons. It stays there. It's not a note that somebody takes and sits on somebody's desk and you're hoping that the right person took that note and processes that information and pushes it along to the right person. An email stays there, and that information that you are applying, that you are attempting to give to them, it's in your own words, and it's there for them to review later if they need to.
It also leaves a digital footprint, which is a pretty important thing in this day and age. It does allow investigators to go back and search digitally about the case and find information that people had submitted. And I think that is very, very important. And again, I can't implore the audience and the listeners enough that if you do have information in regards to any of the cases that we have covered, and that goes from Amy Mihaljevic to Amy Hooper, we can't implore you enough to get out there and share what you have, because it really could be helpful and very helpful for you to get it off your shoulders and off your back. So if you have information, don't hesitate to turn it in, please.
And thank you for having me on, Bill. Again, I've seen the list of guests that you have coming on your fantastic show, and I'm looking forward to listening to those episodes.
Thank you again, Nick. You are always a fabulous guest, and you definitely know what you're talking about, and I know that you want to see resolution in Amy Hooper's case, so I really do appreciate you bringing this on My Passion Case and bringing it to a new audience. So hopefully we will find some resolution. So thanks again, Nick, and I know you're very busy, so have a great day. Thank you guys so much for tuning in this week to my episode with Nick of the True Crime Garage podcast, and much appreciation to him for beaming into the studio for this week's episode of My Passion Case. And if you guys enjoy this independently produced podcast, you can help support the show by clicking on the donate button on the left-hand side of slowburnmedia.com. That is slow minus the W. Or via the Venmo app with my username at Bill-Huffman-3. There will also be a link in the show notes. Any amount is appreciated, and it really does help keep this podcast running. And again, if you do enjoy this podcast, you can always leave a 5-star review wherever you listen to your favorite shows, and that will help keep the show and the cases that I cover in the spotlight. If you like to stay up to date on the cases that I have covered and the new shows that I have in the pipeline, please follow me on Twitter at BillHuffman3. If you are new to the show, all of my previous episodes are available for free wherever you get your favorite podcasts. So again, thank you guys so much for tuning in to this week's episode. If you guys have any information about the case of Amy Hooper or any of the cases that I've covered, Crime Stoppers is always there for you, and you can always remain anonymous. So you guys, thanks so much for listening this week, and until next time, be safe.